another important conversation with ePluribusAmerica. I'm Jeanette Lenoir, and today we are speaking with Gordon Shufelt. He is the author of The Uncommon Case of Daniel Brown, how a white police officer was convicted of killing a Black citizen in Baltimore in 1875, more than 140 years ago, which is very interesting. So Gordon Shufelt is a retired attorney and is an administrative law judge. He has served in the federal government for 30 years. And Gordon Shufelt, thank you so much for joining me and discussing your book. This is obviously a very important book and a very important topic that still resonates across the country. It's an important issue.
Thank you for having me here. I appreciate being here very much.
Absolutely. So why did you think this book was an important topic to write about right now in our current climate?
Well, I was actually working on a different idea for a book, looking at the operation of police justice courts in Baltimore, and I was looking through newspaper accounts of criminal activity, and this just kind of jumped off the page that there would be a conviction of a policeman killing a Black man in 1875. So I started looking more into it. As far as how it connected to the present, I mean, it seemed obvious at the time. I think this was, I'm sure it was kind of in the middle of when there was a flurry of killings of similar cases. This case was especially egregious. And I think as I got into it, why I kept going with it was a feeling that just basic humanity called for kind of remembering Daniel Brown's name. And I'm sorry, that almost gets me emotional. I mean, I started to feel really connected to Daniel Brown and his wife, Keziah Brown. And I felt like just the basic humanity thing, as I said, called for these people ought to be remembered just as so many of the people who suffered abuses should be remembered.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure I answered your question and all that. I kind of got off.
That's okay.
If not, please redirect me. Try.
Yeah, don't worry. You did. Listen, your book is an emotional book. You know, the fact that you feel for Daniel Brown and others like him is very important. So thank you for writing this book, and thank you for bringing this to our attention and honoring him in a way that he deserves to be honored, honoring him in a way that he was failed in his own country. So thank you for that. It is an emotional book. It is an emotional story. How could it not bring tears to your eyes? And what compounds the hurt is that it's still ongoing. We can stay in Baltimore. There's so many cases around the country of police brutality and the injustice that many Black Americans have faced in this country, but we don't even have to go outside of Baltimore. We can simply look to, for example, the latest one is Freddie Gray is another example of, police brutality or the overreach of law enforcement and so forth in that particular region. So the book is a very important book. It touches on the era of Reconstruction, the history of policing, race relations, and including immigration, because Daniel Brown, a Black American, was killed by an Irish immigrant, McGovern. So can you talk about that and talk about, why it matters still today?
Well, why it matters still came across very quickly when I started reading some of the accounts, because there was a protest meeting a few days after Daniel Brown died, and what the protest leaders had to say was, it sounded like something I had heard on television a few days before that. So the connection, the horrible reality that this has been going on that long, that it's felt that way to victims of this for that long is, part of what draws you into the story and why I kept going with it. But I also want to say something about the immigration question and the policeman, the Irish policeman. I tried very hard to bring him to life too. I thought it was important that you not create cartoon characters, cardboard figures. And I don't know how successful I was. It's difficult. If you try to write about Abraham Lincoln or Franklin Roosevelt, you can find out where they bought their ties or their hats or what brand of watch Franklin Roosevelt wore. But when you try to find out about an Irish policeman from 1875 or a black laborer from 1875, it's a little more difficult to find details of their life. But one of my goals, including the book that I was intending to write when I stumbled on this and wound up writing this, was I just wanted to get to what things felt like for people in their day-to-day lives, or what it did to them in their day-to-day lives, what ordinary people were experiencing. And so, I tried to bring Patrick McDonald, the policeman, to life in that sense too. He's not a very likable person when you get closer to him, but you can see how he got drawn into what he did. There's certainly doesn't justify anything he did. It's way over the top. I don't. Maybe I should recount the specific details of how Daniel Brown was killed, because I think it's important to understand how brutal it was. May I just go with that for a few minutes?
Please tell us. Tell us.
There was a social gathering, and there was a sailor who was a lodger in Daniel Brown's house, and he was about to go away on a trip, and they had a social gathering. I believe most of the people were church-going Christians, and they didn't drink. There's pretty clear evidence that there was no alcohol, there were no drugs, there were no weapons in the house. There was some singing, and because a lot of the people were domestic servants who worked late, you work in the house, you clean up the dishes after the dinner and put them away and clean up the dining room before you can go home. So late night is not unusual for the people who were there. A lot of them were domestic servants in the homes of people who lived important, powerful people who lived nearby. So there was some singing, and someone complained about the sound of the singing, and the policeman came to the door. There was kind of an exchange in the doorway. One person went to the door and told the policeman that fine, we'll be quiet, but let me speak to the owner of the property, he said, or the proprietor of the house, I guess. Mm-hmm. So Daniel Brown went to the door. Well, apparently Daniel Brown took some pride in the fact that this was his home. He had worked very hard to be able to have his own home, mm-hmm. and he felt like he could do what he wanted to do as long as he wasn't violating the law. And the policeman kind of didn't like that, I guess. The policeman said he was being saucy or something like that. So at some point, the policeman just charged at Brown, struck him on one side of the head, and pretty much knocked him almost unconscious. He slumped to the floor, and the policeman went into the house. Keziah Brown got between Daniel Brown, who is now disabled and on the floor, and the policeman, and asked her, "Please don't shoot my husband." And he spun her out of the way, and he shot over her shoulder and shot him in the head. So it was brutal. It was terrible. Anyway, I want people to understand what the nature of the crime was and what was going on. And I think people should understand that in the end, the policeman who did this served very short. He was convicted, but he served a very short time in the city jail where his fellow policemen were taking care of him. He served less than a year. So if you put the crime together with what happened to the policeman, it's kind of horrifying in a sense, even though there's a conviction.
And that's what's very unique about this particular story, because it serves as a very pivotal moment in our American history and culture. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because this is really one of the first times that a police officer was convicted of manslaughter in the death of a Black American. Can you delve into that a little bit and touch on all the different dynamics that went into play to even making this conviction happen, even though he didn't even serve the full 5 years he was
Well,
charged with.
One of the things you have to understand is that neither the Black community nor the white community was a unified social group at the time. There were divisions in both. The people who were at the social event, Black people at the social event, were people, as I mentioned a few minutes ago. A lot of them, and they turned out to be the witnesses at the trial, were people who worked in the homes of very prominent, powerful people, influential people. I don't know if they were powerful. They were certainly rich enough to keep living. So, on the other hand, the police were not terribly popular because there were great divisions in Baltimore at the time. They had gone through a civil war in which Baltimore was kind of poised in the middle. Thousands of people in Baltimore fought on the Confederate side, thousands fought on the northern side. And the police force, which was a new institution, only formed in the 1850s. So it was kind of trying to feel its way to what it really would be. It was immediately taken control of by political forces to control elections. Well, what happened was the city was so divided over a period of a couple of decades, one side, then the other, of fairly influential white people in the city got control of the police force. And they used them not only against Black people, they used them also against their white adversaries. So a lot of white people didn't trust the police. And that made a big difference at this time. I think that's when we think about connecting it to the present, I think you get a lot more kind of, I don't want to state it in too derogatory way, but kind of blind acceptance of, in white middle class or upper class white communities, a blind acceptance of the policemen are the good guys. It wasn't that way at that time. And I think understanding that some policemen can do bad things makes a big difference.
One of the other things you noted was it wasn't necessarily that the white citizens were upset that a white police officer killed a Black man, but that they became uncomfortable because it affected the social order that was in place.
And they became uncomfortable because the policeman didn't understand that he didn't have a right to charge into a private home. And the judge made that clear a couple of times in the trial. He directed the jury to understand that a policeman does not have a right to charge into someone's or invade someone's home. So white people were worried about that kind of thing happening, frankly, to them. They didn't want that going on. And so that was a lot of the motive. And they, the other thing that happened along those lines was that neither the police nor the police board seemed to understand what the law was as far as what the police were allowed to do as far as going into private homes. The police board had issued an order or a directive to the police, and that they were allowed to break down doors and go in houses if they heard noise or disturbance. And the judge didn't like that. Well, the irony there was one of the police board members was a brother of the judge in the trial. But, it upset them that there was violence and gunshots within hearing of their own homes. I'm talking about the influential white people. A couple of people who lived within a few blocks were a senator named Reverdy Johnson, who was a very influential senator. An attorney named Charles Bonaparte, who was actually a descendant of the famous Bonaparte family of France. These were very wealthy, very powerful people. And I don't know whether they actually heard the gunshots, or the gunshot. It was only one shot. But they might have. It was that close to their homes. And I would point out that the way the city was segregated at the time was a little different than the kind of regional segregation you see in a city like Baltimore today. The Browns lived in a very narrow cut-through street behind the homes of these people, and things were arranged so that the servants or people who worked or did to work for the people in the big, beautiful uh, brick houses on the main wide streets could be nearby. I mean, if they were live-in or servants or people who were domestic servants in the homes and they need to be there a lot of hours.
Mhm.
You wound up with a lot of Black people living very close to white people, but they lived in very different kinds of houses.
I see. So talk about your own work as an attorney and an administrative judge. How many of these types of cases have you dealt
Oh,
with?
I didn't work with that kind of. I worked with veterans law. I was a veterans law judge, and uh, no, I did not work with criminal law, and I did not work with this. This is really more my. This is my historian side. I was a judge, and I have a law degree. I was an administrative law judge, and I have a law degree, but I also have a PhD in history from American University. So this is my historian side much more than my lawyer side. Although I did try to use my lawyer side a little bit in analyzing why the case came out the way it did at the end of the book.
Something you also write about is how Baltimore was one of the first cities to actually establish an organized police force. And yet there's so little history or studies that have been done about the history of policing in that region. And as you mentioned, it's such a unique area because, you know, some of the folks fought on the Union side, the others fought on the Confederate side. So it serves as an important an important place to talk about the historical uh, aspects and impact of policing. You know, especially when you look at later cases like Freddie Gray or Eric Gardner, all these other cases. Can you talk a little bit about that? About the lack of really a deep dive and a deep study into the history of policing in Baltimore and how we could use that to shape a better world for all of us.
Well, yeah, I think Baltimore is underappreciated by historians, and I'm not sure why. It was actually the third or fourth largest city in the country in the middle of the 19th century. And as you said, it brought together a lot of Southern culture and politics and history, and it brought together some Northern politics and history. It had a lot of commercial connections to the North and to farmers in the West with non-slave areas. So it brings together a lot of that. And, I haven't lived in Baltimore. I've lived in Maryland, and I almost have a feeling even today, Baltimore can't quite figure out whether it's a southern city or not. A lot of that came together in Baltimore, and then of course you had at the very time the police force was formed in the 1850s, and the police were uniformed and kind of militarized and armed. You had a tremendous influx of Black people into the city. And this was, Baltimore was the first, Baltimore and Washington were really, in a way, the first cities that experienced this change in their demography. Philadelphia was a destination for some Black migrants in the later 19th century, eventually New York, Chicago, and these other places were. But Baltimore was the first, Baltimore and Washington, I think, were the first places where it happened to that magnitude. So Baltimore is really an important place to understand American history, and I think even today we see the echoes of a lot of this.
Right, and even today, there's so many important, important people that still call Baltimore home. I mean, even the history of Frederick Douglass and old ancient African American burial grounds. There's so much history in Baltimore that is so overlooked. I wonder if it has to do with the state of Baltimore. You just have to go to Baltimore and see how people live there, how poor and mainly Black people live in Baltimore versus their white folks live in Baltimore. I mean, you can walk down one street and then the next street, I mean, it's you see real segregation at play in Baltimore to this day. To this day, you see this in Baltimore. Can you talk about that and how we can learn lessons from Daniel Brown, lessons that we should have learned but we haven't learned?
Well, that's a tough one, because you would think that it's fairly obvious that you ought to treat people better. But I think one of the things that you find there is that the fact that some of the Black people had connections to influential people in ways that made influential people care about them. When, in a way, it was almost, despite the fact that it was so close to the slavery era, in some ways there were some things that were better then than they are now, because as I mentioned before, the way the city was segregated then at least brought people closer together and had some more contact. It was still bad. There was lots of bad things that happened. But today, the segregation it's much more Black neighborhood on the west side of Baltimore and whites in nicer areas around the Inner Harbor and more to the East Baltimore. So that people are really separate, and we need ways for the police, the people who control the police, the people who care about what the police do, to just be close enough to other people to appreciate their humanity. I don't. That sounds kind of trite almost, but it seems to me that it just comes down to basic decency and humanity to make it better. If people would just see past their maybe. I like to think of it as the problem with their unexamined assumptions about the nature of things.
How can the story of Daniel Brown facilitate the process of recognizing our collective humanity?
Well, I think I tried to bring out what Daniel Brown was like and what his life was like and what he was trying to do and how that was cut short and how terrible that was. And I tried to bring out how a person who maybe had some personality flaws was drawn into a situation where he kind of felt free to be violent, and that's I think part of the thing was part of the problem there was that I don't think the policeman really understood the culture of the influential white people in the city, and so he took it for granted that he was free to do things that he really wasn't supposed to do. I'm sorry, I'm afraid I'm off on a tangent and not answering your question again, but you're asking me how it helps us understand what we need to do to be better at this.
Our collective humanity.
Well, I think look at the fact that the case went forward because people knew each other and cared about each other. It's that simple. I mean, the police have to understand the people in the communities that they're policing. The police have to have connections to the people in the community that they're policing, and the policemen should come from the community and understand and care about it. And honestly, I do believe that a lot of policemen do. I wouldn't condemn all policemen, but I mean, I don't know how to think about the problem, but you're sending armed people into a community with frankly a license to kill under certain circumstances. So even if most of your policemen are good people doing the right thing and care, a handful of bad policemen can do a lot of damage and a lot of harm. It's really important to think about how you hire policemen. Hiring policemen in the 19th century, when Patrick McDonald, the policeman who killed Daniel Brown, was hired, was pretty not very thoughtful. I mean, it was a matter of ward politics and knowing somebody in the ward. And I believe they required people to be able to write their name, but not much more than that, and be physically able to, handle the situations. So I think one of the things is really important. How do you hire police police. There's so much discretionary authority. They encounter people in the night in places where nobody else is there to watch.
Yeah.
I mean, more recently, we have
Yeah.
electronic devices, so we see some of this, and it's horrifying when we see it.
Mhm.
But even with the electronic devices, you have to trust police. If you're going to have a decent community, you have the police you can trust, because they're walking around out there, or driving around, or encountering people
Mhm.
on a highway, in an alley, who knows where nobody else is really watching. I know they talk about body cameras and all, but it seems like they're strangely off a lot of times.
Right. Isn't that interesting? And so I agree with you. In a perfect world, it would make sense to trust the police who are working on the public's behalf. It would, but since body cameras and videos and technology has given a rise to really exposing some of the god awful behavior coming from those who are charged with protecting and serving the community. How do you encourage a community to trust the police when we see over and over and over again the lengths they have gone and continue to go to violate people's humanity, their human rights? I mean, even how we train police officers. I mean, police officers are trained to dehumanize that person, and it doesn't matter if that person is innocent, guilty. It doesn't matter, or if they're encountered in an alley or whatnot. I mean, it's the training behind our policing lacks humanity. What are your thoughts on that?
My head is so much in the 19th century, and so it was virtually no training in the 19th century. But I absolutely agree with the notion that the training is terribly important. I can't say I'm well versed about what training is done now, but judging by what we see when these electronic devices pick things up, the training either isn't correct or it isn't sinking in, because
Right.
we seem to be seeing a lot of behavior that we shouldn't see if the training was right and the hiring was right. But I go back to more than the training, the hiring. Somehow or other, you have to figure out what kind of person you're hiring. Look, there's a temptation to someone who'd like to have authority and bully people to say, I'd like to be a cop. That sounds like a chance to do things that I kind of like to do if I'm not such a good person. I mean, we need to get at it, to figure out a way to not hire those people who, as I said, I think the heart of the matter is the amount of discretion that a police officer has. And I'm not sure I know how to get around that. There has to be a way that they will behave well when nobody's looking. I don't know if somebody said something once, we all behave well when everybody's looking. It's when nobody's looking that your character's tested.
Exactly. It's called integrity.
Yes.
Yeah, get used to it. Everyone.
And I would add humanity, just people with a sense of humanity.
Yeah, absolutely. What should people take away from this book, especially in the era of Black Lives Matter? Because you can actually make a connection, because Blacks and whites came together on behalf of Daniel Brown. And it was, I'm sure, a white jury that convicted him, a state's attorney, and even the coroner's report. All of this plays a role.
And there were people that were trying to do the right thing, I think, as they understood it. Some people kind of undermined the result in the end. But I agree. I mean, there were people who cared about this and cared about the people who were in the house when this terrible thing happened. And if you can get situations where people care about each other across these terrible lines that we've drawn between each other, things can be better. But one of the things I would, on the kind of the negative side, and the side that might motivate us to pay more attention, is, my God, how similar the feelings were in the Black community when this happened. The things they complained about, and it wasn't just the killing. They talked about how their children were being bullied on the street, and policemen were searching their homes and things like that, and things that just never surfaced.
Mhm.
And you realize if a policeman doesn't make an arrest, he just bullies somebody. It doesn't even go before a magistrate or anybody where anybody could voice anything about it. And if you're a poor person, a poor neighborhood, are you sure if a policeman came and bullied me, I kind of have some options as to go to authorities and do something about it. But that's not so easy if you're a poor person in a poor neighborhood,
That's right.
or that the system,
Mhm.
or believe that the system's stacked against you. So I think there's a lot in that sense, in a really negative sense, to realize that something this horrible, so similar to what we see today, when has been going on so long, ought to maybe motivate a lot of people to pay more attention, and especially people who have the authority to make decisions about how police are hired, how they're trained, whether they ought to be armed, and all kinds of questions.
Do
And
you?
let me add. Go ahead. I just want to say, if you live in a poor neighborhood, black or white, there's crime. There are criminals, and people need good policing. The idea of just getting rid of the police just doesn't make sense, and I don't think people in poor neighborhoods want that. They want police who are good police. They need it. There is crime. I mean, come on,
Right.
that happens.
Yes.
I'm sorry, I
Well,
interrupted.
to clarify, the defund the police movement isn't asking to get rid of police. They're saying to not give them so much financial power. And even if you look at our country, the largest portion of our budget goes to our military.
Sounded like I was saying I believe that the defund the police movement was to remove police. I understand that that's not what they're doing, and I wouldn't want anybody to attribute that notion to the people who are saying
Yeah,
defund.
but I think that's the misconception that derails this legitimate call for change.
I want to make one more remark about that, though, and I wonder whether we shouldn't think about the fact that there was a movement when the police were formed. They were formed. The police department was arranged so much along military lines back then at the beginning, and whether that was not a misstep, and maybe we ought to give some thought to that.
Yeah, I hope your book serves some of that purpose. And I also am so grateful that you brought Daniel Brown back to life.
Thank you. That means a lot to me that you appreciate that. And I want to add Keziah Brown. I wish I was able to present more about Keziah Brown. Her involvement in the matter is one of the most moving things in the book. I'm not even going to try to go into that because I don't want to get emotional again. But Keziah Brown was heroic and ought to be remembered and appreciated too.
It's a wonderful story. It really is. Where can people find this book and get to know the Brown family and get to learn more about what happened to him and some of the history of policing in the 19th century in Baltimore?
The book is published by Kent State University Press. That's not Penn State. That's Kent State, one in Ohio. Kent State University Press, and it's certainly available through their website. Actually, if you Google "Uncommon Case of Daniel Brown" on your Google machine, probably the Amazon page would give it to you. But I don't know whether it makes Kent State people happier if you go directly to their page. But I appreciate their publishing it. So go to the Kent State University Press page, and it'll tell you everything you need to know about the book and how to get it.
All right, but it can also be found on Amazon, right?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
All right,
it's out there.
All right. What else would you like people to know about this book?
Maybe I said it already, but I'd like people to know that it's really an effort to make people understand what events like this mean to people who are living their everyday lives, and all the people involved. There's a whole chapter on Patrick McDonald, the immigrant policeman, as well as on Daniel Brown and what his background was, as best as I could piece it together. So yeah, I'd like people to know that you can, and I think it's important that people understand the humanity of people involved in these events. Sometimes I think we see them on television or on a newspaper headline, and it just seems very distant.
Yeah.
Please try to understand the humanity of people involved.
I love that. I love that. The motto of ePluribusAmerica is humanity starts with culture. And this is such a fitting book for what we do here. And it is a fitting legacy for Daniel Brown and his wife and the Black community. Yeah, that's right. So is there anything I haven't asked that you think is important to know?
No, I think we've gotten through all of it. There is some maneuvering legally that got the police officer off the hook, and I do think there's reason to question whether most of it was done on purpose to get the policeman off the hook. But
yeah,
that's you can't prove that. So I just I think I laid it out in the book that you can look at the facts and think about that yourself.
That's right. All right. Well, Gordon Schufelt, it was an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I want to thank you again for humanizing Daniel Brown and his story, and bringing this and writing this book, taking the time to document the story before it was completely forgotten. So thank you so much, and thank you for speaking with us today on ePluribusAmerica. I really appreciate it.
I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Of course. And thank you all so much for joining us for another great conversation. I'm Jeanette Lenoir with ePluribusAmerica, and this is Our American Culture.